Amen. Ephesians chapter 5 for our study this morning. Heard about a little girl who after a church service one Sunday morning asked her mother a question. Mommy, she asked, if God is as big as they say he is, and if he lives in our hearts, shouldn't he show through? And that is a good question. And one that the Apostle Paul has been talking about here in this section of his letter to the Ephesians. For he said, if God is as big as he is, and if he lives in our hearts, shouldn't he show through our lives? That's what we've been considering in our studies here in the book of Ephesians, that the presence of Christ in our life ought to make a dramatic, visible difference to others around us. We should walk our talk. And they should see the presence of Christ in us. And so we've noticed last time in our study how his presence works its way out in our lives in certain visible attributes. For example, we saw some of the differences back in verse 32 of chapter 4 as how we are to be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another even as God in Christ forgave you. And so we are to be kind, tender-hearted, compassionate, and forgiving people. We saw in our study last time in verse 2 of Ephesians 5 how we ought to be walking in love. And now as we resume our study, picking up in verse 8 this morning, we're going to see that we are also to be walking in light. Join with me, please, beginning in verse 8, where we read, for you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth, finding out what is acceptable to the Lord. And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of those things which are done by them in secret. But all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light, for whatever makes manifest is light. Therefore he says, awake, you who sleep, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. And so we see how as Christians we ought not only to be walking in love, but also walking in light. Going back to verse 8, Paul describes once again what our life was like before Christ came into our hearts. He says, for you were once darkness. Notice he doesn't say you were once in darkness, although we were. He says you were once darkness. Everything about your life, everything about your old nature was darkness. You moved in a cloud of darkness. The activities you were engaged in were darkness. Everything about the old you was darkness. But going on, he says, now you are light in the Lord. And again, notice he doesn't say that you are in the light of the Lord, but he says you are light of the Lord. And I think this is what Jesus was saying in Matthew chapter 5 when he said to us, you are the light of the world. We're not just walking in the light, we are the light. And yet when Jesus said that to us in Matthew 5, over in the Gospel of John, he would say of himself, I am the light of the world. I am the light, you are the light. I am the light, you are the light. And I begin to kind of realize that there's a problem here. If you're the light, then how am I the light? When it dawns on me that the light that I am in the world really is nothing more than his light reflected through my life. Just as the moon has no original light of its own, but rather is a reflection of the sun, so too is your life and mine to be a reflection of the sunlight shining through our life, just like that little girl asked her mother. Shouldn't he show through us? Absolutely, saints. And so we don't only walk in the light, but we are his light before the world. Someone has well likened our lives to the moon. And if you've ever watched the moon, as I have, I was one of those ancient astronomers growing up, my little telescope perched atop a treetop out in my backyard, checking out the craters and everything. I thought I could see the lunar module on the surface there. No. But anyway, something I've noticed about the moon is it does one of two things. It either grows broader and brighter, or it grows dimmer and darker. And one of those two things is true of your life and mine in the Lord. As a reflection of His light, either we're growing broader and brighter for the glory of God, or we are growing darker and dimmer because something has gotten in the way of His reflection in our life. We see those from time to time around here, don't we? We call them lunar eclipses. I remember it wasn't too many Saturdays ago, we were doing prayer meeting here as we do every Saturday night, and somebody came running and saying, "Have you seen the moon? Have you seen the moon?" And I'm like, "Oh, this is it. Jesus is coming. It's turning to blood. Whoa, I got to go see this." And it was a lunar eclipse. And I realized at that time that it was because the earth had gotten in the way of the sun's light on the moon. Listen, folks, when we begin to become dimmer and darker, it's because something has gotten in the way of our lives, reflecting the glory of God. You see, Paul tells us here that we are light in the Lord. Therefore, we are to walk as children of light. And if we walk as children of light, we see from the verses that follow two things that are going to happen. First of all, the fruit of the Spirit is going to be produced in our life, verses 9 and 10. And then there is going to be a radical change in our opinion, in our relationship, in our attitude towards sin and darkness, verses 11 and following. And so first of all, let's consider walking as children in the light, the fruit of the Spirit that is manifest in our life. Verse 9. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth, finding out what is acceptable to the Lord. And so the first result of walking in light, being the light of the Lord, is that the fruit of the Spirit is produced in our life. Now, here's the beauty of that. Just like a fruit tree sitting out in your backyard, although dormant this time of year, can't you wait for spring to roll around? The buds are going to spring forth, the flowers, and pretty soon some fruit is going to be hanging from those branches. But you know, the incredible thing about that is all you do is you water that tree and you feed it a little bit of tree food or fertilizer, nurture it a little bit, and the next thing you know, boom, it produces a peach. It bears a pear. Something is hanging. It doesn't have to, it doesn't have to groan and grunt and strain and work at producing fruit. It is a natural byproduct of what it is. And the same thing is true of our life. Spiritual fruit is a byproduct produced in our life from walking in the Spirit, walking in the Lord. You don't have to struggle to produce it. You don't have to sweat. You don't have to strive. It is just a natural process that is worked out by the Spirit in our life that this fruit is produced. And so we're going to look at some of this fruit that's spoken of here in verse 9. First of all is goodness. The fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness. Now that word goodness actually comes from the root word for the word love, agapeo. The same root word is used for the word goodness here. And so some have accurately said that goodness is simply love in action. I like that. Goodness is love in action. It is love demonstrated. Charles Spurgeon put it this way. He said, do all the good that you can to all the people that you can in all the ways that you can as often as you can for as long as you can. Got it? That's good. Yeah. Do all the good that you can to all the people that you can in all the ways that you can as often as you can for as long as you can. That is goodness. And folks, that's what the world is looking for in our lives. As we've shared in previous studies in this book, the world knows that as Christians there are things we do and there are things that we don't do. And one of the things that they know we do is we're good, or we ought to be. And so they are looking for goodness, for love personified, love demonstrated in our lives. The second thing that we see spoken of here is righteousness. Jesus told us that when we do our righteousness or when we do our good deeds, we are to do them before men in such a manner that when men see them, they give glory to our Father in heaven. And the word there actually for righteousness is a word that speaks of living with integrity before men and before God. We ought to be people of integrity. You know, there is an integrity crisis in our country today. And that ought not to be so of us as Christians. We ought to be people of integrity, of ethics, of character. Someone has well said that when wealth is lost, nothing is lost. When health is lost, something is lost. But when integrity is lost, all is lost. It's very true. Because if you're not a person of integrity, what else is left? And you see, that's why the apostle goes on and continuing here, and he says we ought to be in goodness, righteousness, and note this, truth. That word truth actually means that we should be people of our word. No deception, no falsehood. Our yes is yes, our no is no. What you see is what you get. You don't walk away scratching your head saying, I wonder what they meant by what they said. No, you are a person of your word. They can take it at face value for what you said because you speak truth. And listen, if we are going to walk in truth, doesn't it stand to reason that we ought to study the truth? And that is why we have committed ourselves to a study of the Scriptures here at Calvary Chapel. In his cynical tone of voice, Pilate challenged Jesus on trial before him in saying, what is truth? That question is being asked again today, folks. And Jesus answered that question when, in speaking to the Father, he said, thy word is truth. You see, there's a lot of stuff represented as truth in our world today that is really not true at all. And all you have to do is slip into a secular classroom on a public school campus and see the reality of that. They teach from the textbook and they teach from the classroom things like evolution is truth. It's no longer theory, but it's fact. Although it is flawed and filled with loopholes and missing links, nonetheless, they still assert, they still present it as a reality rather than a fictitious rendering of a man named Charles Darwin. And so a lot of what is being represented as truth today is not truth at all. And yet as people who walk in the truth, we would do well to know the truth. And that is why we have committed ourselves to a study of the truth here in the Scriptures, God's Word. And so we see the fruit of the Spirit, goodness, righteousness, and truth, all produced in our life as a result of walking as children of light. Finding out what is acceptable to the Lord. And we'll talk about that more in a moment when we get to verse 17. But that's the first result of walking as children of the light. Now here is the second result, beginning now in verse 11. We have a radical change in attitude towards sin and darkness, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of those things which are done by them in secret. But all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light, for whatever makes manifest is light. And so the second result in our life of walking in light as children of the light is that we are no longer neutral towards the subject of sin. There may have been a time in your life where, live and let live, what will be, will be. And we really didn't care one way or another about sin. And in fact, moving in darkness, as we did, we often embrace sinful attitudes and yes, even sinful conduct and actions. But as a Christian, not only are we to oppose it, verse 11 says, having no fellowship with it, but see what the rest of that verse says? We are to expose it. Not only are we to oppose it, but we are to expose it. And I think you can understand what that means when you again consider how we are the light of the Lord. There's something about light that exposes darkness. when you walk into a dark room so as not to stub your toe, isn't one of the first things that you do is flip on the light switch and the darkness disappears. It's exposed and it flees. As Christians, the same is true of our life. And I believe that sometimes we expose the darkness without even so much as a word or a gesture, but just who we are in Jesus Christ. Have you ever walked into a room where they were telling that joke, and then suddenly they just stopped talking when you walk into the room? Hey, listen, I used to be a cop. And I can remember walking into the locker room, the squad room, even getting into a patrol car with my partner, and suddenly, mum's the word, Brian's here. They would be talking about some sordid, sensual, dirty, polluted thing, and suddenly, the moment I walked in, the lips were zipped, and the conversation ceased. Not a word was said. I didn't have to say anything. They certainly didn't say anything anymore. What happened? The light had exposed the darkness. You see, that's what Paul is saying here in verse 13. But all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light, for whatever makes manifest is light. Your simple appearance, the very presence of Jesus Christ in your life, as the light dispels and exposes darkness. Now, I'm going to resist the soapbox derby here this morning and the tendency I have around here from time to time to get onto my soapbox. But I will say this, even as I shared Thursday night. I have once again have to applaud the man in the White House. You may not agree with him, you may not like him, you may not vote for him, but he did a very unpopular thing in an election year by taking a stand for marriage. Proposing a constitutional amendment against gay marriage, defining monogamous marriage, is not the way you win votes in an election year. I doubt that was the advice of his campaign manager. But I do believe that George W. is in fact listening to God. As I have watched this presidential administration, unparalleled in some of its former administrations, take a stand for morality and, yes, even biblical principles. You may not agree with his foreign policy. You may think he's an ignoramus about Islam and all the rest of this stuff. You may not like taxes or financial things. But I got to tell you, he's trying to clean up moral America. We're in the gutter. And even if it takes a constitutional amendment to get us out, I see some good things coming from Washington, and I thought I wouldn't say that after the last administration. By the way, well, this is premature. I'll wait till I get there. Okay, soapbox, stay put. Really. But we're exposing the darkness by the glorious light. I mean, look at that. You got to know that the mayor of San Francisco isn't going to vote for George this year. Really. None of those people that are getting married over there are going to vote for George this year. But I applaud him because he doesn't yield to the political correctness of our age. But he takes a stand for the moral uprightness, the truth, and the light that I believe God would so occupy our lives with. And so we see how we can't be neutral towards sin, Christians. You not only oppose it, but you got to expose it. And sometimes that just means being you in the Lord. Walking into a dark environment and boom, suddenly the light shines. So Paul continues in verse 14. And therefore he says, awake, you who sleep. And that's why you're at second service this morning, right? Arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. As a church, this is no time to be sleeping or slumbering. This is no time to be snoozing. You've heard it said, snooze and you lose. We ought to be alert. We ought to be awake. We ought to be aware of what's going down in our midst. And I'll talk more about that now as we go on to verse 15. I'm sorry, not verse 15. Yeah, verse 15. Because I think we are seeing some opportunities, once again, set before us, unparalleled in recent years. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not be drunk with wine, in which is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always for all things. Did he say all things? Does your Bible say all things? If it doesn't say all things, get another Bible, because it says all things in the Bible. To God the Father, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another in the fear of God. And so, as we're challenged to awake, to arise, Paul reminds us now in the verses to follow that we ought to walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. Now that word circumspectly means carefully. In other words, what Paul is saying is watch your step. Watch how you walk, and be sure and walk carefully and wisely in these days because of the evil around us, redeeming the time because the days are evil. You don't have to look far, folks, to see that we are living in an evil age. And that's why the admonition of this scripture is so timely. We ought to make the most of our time, because the fact of the matter is that every one of us has been given a certain number of days on this earth, and not a one of us knows when that last day is up. Not a one of us. That's why the psalmist wrote in Psalm 90, "Teach me to number our days, that we may apply our hearts to wisdom." You want to walk wisely before the Lord? Redeem the time. Number your days. Realize you have only so much time on this earth, and take advantage of every day. You don't have any to squander. Researchers who study this kind of stuff tell us that in an average lifetime, the average American spends 3 years in business meetings, 13 years watching TV, spends $89,281 on food. Now that may not have factored in inflation. Consumes, get this, 109,354 pounds of food. You know what that means? You and I each eat over 50 tons of food in a lifetime. Make you sound like a glutton? Sure makes me feel that way. Whoa. Catch this one. This is good. Makes 1,811 trips to McDonald's. Now, I know some of you think that I broke the number on that. Spends $6,881 in vending machines. Remember that next time you stick the quarter in the machine. Eats 35,138 cookies and 1,483 pounds of candy. The average American in their lifetime will catch 304 colds, is involved in 6 motor vehicle accidents, and I know some of you are pushing the odds up on that one, is hospitalized for men 8 times, women 12, and spends 24 years just sleeping. In his book entitled "When I Relax, I Feel Guilty," what a title, huh? Author Tim Hansel quotes an article entitled, "If you are 35, you only have 500 days left to live." Its thesis is this: that when you subtract the time spent sleeping, working, tending to personal matters, hygiene, odd chores, medical matters, eating, traveling, and all the miscellaneous time stealers, in the next 35 years, which the life expectancy is about 70 years in our country now, you will have roughly the equivalent of only 500 days left to spend as you wish. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm over 35, which means that I may only have about 350 days left, and some of you, the days are really getting low there. The point is redeeming the time. You don't know how much time you have left. You may have, comparatively speaking, only 5 days a week at most. And so we ought to walk wisely. And we ought to heed what the Scripture is saying here, redeeming the time, making the most of every opportunity. Because, folks, back on the soapbox, seriously. I believe that once again, we as a church, not just Calvary, but all the churches here and in our country, have been given an incredible opportunity to spread the love and good news of Jesus Christ. You know what I'm talking about. The movie. Some of you have seen it. My son last night, right in the middle of prayer meeting, calls me to say, Dad, we're down here and the line for the movie is around the building 1.5 times. He's blown away because every showing of the movie, as you well know, has been sold out. So much so that Thursday night, before the final box office tabulations were completed, which ended Saturday night midnight, The Passion of the Christ was already ranking the 3rd biggest box office smash in history. And with the projection of every showing through the weekend being sold out, it is expected to topple the #1 movie, which you may be interested to know, was Star Wars. Analysts believe that this movie is going to unseat Star Wars as the #1 box office opening in history. We will know more about that subject probably tonight or tomorrow morning as the figures are calculated. But here's my point. People are not just hearing about what Jesus did anymore, but in very visual form, they're seeing it, perhaps for the first time. And there are scores of people leaving movie theaters in tears. Some have shared with me watching people walk out still with their Coke full and their popcorn overflowing. They bought those things going into the movie thinking they would eat them, but were gripped by the intensity of the flick, so much so that the soda remained untouched, as did the popcorn, and they're now taking it with them as they leave. People are seen leaving in tears. And yes, the Church of Jesus Christ here in America, once again, has an opportunity to respond. Will we? What are we going to do? Because listen, just like we've seen with previous opportunities, they have a very limited frame of time, and that window of opportunity will slip away. Many of you know that after 9/11, we traveled to Ground Zero 3 times as a church and ministered to the emergency personnel, the demolition and construction workers, the people who had lost families and loved ones. The first trip that we went shortly before Thanksgiving of that year, we saw people coming up to us asking for tracts and wanting to hear about Jesus. But a couple of months later, in February of the following year, when we returned, all the inquiries weren't nearly as numerous. And by the time our youth group traveled there in March, well, they were having to hunt people down to share the message with, because life in America had slowly returned to normal. We're creatures of habit, and we're prone to doing that. Which means that when the opportunity presents itself, we need to redeem the time. We need to seize the moment, because if we don't, it is going to slip through our fingers. It is going to pass us by, and I believe we will be accountable to God for what we have done with the opportunities He gives us. And so I challenge you to be praying about how the Lord would have you involved in responding to people's inquiries and what is going on in the aftermath of this movie. It's a little premature for me to share with you. I'm going to be doing some checking around the fellowships on the mountain this week, but maybe later in the week or next weekend I will share with you guys some of the things that we're going to be doing. I don't want to do that this morning because I still need to look into some matters. But I think that we have an opportunity that we want to take advantage of. We want to redeem the time. Notice this, because the apostle continues in that verse in saying that because the days are evil. You know, people often look upon evil, wicked, sin-filled times as a challenge to getting the message out. It's an evil age, therefore we feel kind of shut down or silenced or shut up, and we see that as almost a hurdle or an obstacle, and yet I believe what Paul is expressing here is just the opposite. There is a tone of optimism in what he's saying. He's saying because the days are evil, we need to take advantage of the time right now. The opportunity has never been better. Because people are ready to hang up this evil stuff. Their lives are empty. They've found that there's nothing to be experienced in that. And as I shared with you last Sunday morning in our presentation on the Turkey trip, that was our experience there. In these heavily Islamic countries where if you convert to Christianity, you are killed, you are executed. We spoke to one Muslim after another who was so disillusioned with their faith. I am convinced that once the political environment of that region of the world changes, there is going to be a massive outpouring of salvation for Christ. And so we want to posture ourselves, we want to position ourselves, not just as this body, but as the church at large, to be able to reach out to those people when they are ready to forsake Muhammad and Allah and the Quran and turn to the true and living God of heaven and give their life to Jesus Christ. I am convinced that some of the people that we spoke to would have done it right then and there if it wasn't for the fear of being ostracized for their family, losing their jobs, and potentially imprisoned for converting to Christianity. Everyone we spoke to, huh, Rusty? So many were so fed up with it. It's hollow. It's empty. It's ritualistic. And as we showed you in the pictures last week, the prayer towers go off 5 times a day. Nobody stops. Nobody prays because it's empty. It's evil, and they know that. But they're bound by the captivity of their political system for fear of converting. And yet, even as we saw firsthand, many of them are. And meeting in underground churches as we had opportunity to move and minister and fellowship with. And it was incredible. Folks, we need to be ready. We need to redeem the time, and we need to seek the Lord, how He would have us utilize, capitalize on these opportunities that the Word gets out and that souls are saved in these last days. Therefore, verse 17, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. You see, the wise man is one who understands what the will of the Lord is. Going now back to verse 10, he is the man who finds out what is acceptable, what is pleasing to the Lord. And I can't begin to tell you how many Christians seem to struggle in this area of knowing God's will for their life. Probably the most frequently asked question that I receive as a pastor, maybe you do too, is what is God's will for my life? How do I know God's will for my life? Listen, God's will is not a secret. It is not some cosmic mystery for you to discover. God's will is plainly printed out for your life right here in the book you have open on your lap this morning. And I know that's going to blow some of your minds, but it's been right here under your nose all the time. But you see, here's what happens. Rather than looking to the book, we want to look to a man. Hey, can you tell me what God wants from me in this situation? Hey, I need to counsel with you, Pastor. I need your advice. Can you tell me? It's right here, man. Right here, in black and white. And yes, if you have red letters, that one too. God's will is not a mystery. It is not a secret. Our dilemma is that too often we don't want to commit the time or expend the energy involved in searching out the Scriptures to discern God's will. And so we walk around wondering, doubting, and even questioning what God's will for our life really is. Folks, I'm going to give you some help this morning. I'm going to give you a good starting point in chasing down the Scriptures to discern the will of God for your life. First of all, it's going to take some time and it's going to take some study. And if you are unwilling to do that, then don't even bother starting because you're just going to frustrate yourself. But if you are serious about this, Pick up a concordance, which is a book that has every word of the Bible listed and every verse of the Bible that word appears in. And I challenge you to look up the word will, pleasing, acceptable, and reasonable. Some of those words in the concordance, and then chase those verses down. Not every one will apply, but many of them will. And I'm going to do you a really big favor now. I'm going to give you a starting point. Start with Hebrews 11 and verse 6. That's a great starting point, folks, because it tells us there in Hebrews 11 and verse 6 that without faith, it is impossible to please God. The first step in walking in God's will is you've got to be a person of faith. You've got to have faith in God. Anything short of that isn't going to work. This is what's pleasing and acceptable in His sight. Without faith, it's impossible to please Him. Okay, I'll give you one more just to get you started, okay? Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Chase it down. It speaks about offering ourselves as living sacrifices, which is holy and acceptable expression, our reasonable service of worship. Use those verses and take off now on a search, on a study of the Scriptures of what God's revealed will for your life is. Because listen, I believe only as you know His will revealed here in His Word will He grant to you specific direction in your life for the questions you may be asking of Him. Should I marry so-and-so? Should I take that job? Should I move to there? Should I, all of that is secondary to what He speaks here in His Word to us about. And only after you chase this down will He begin to speak specific direction in your life. And so we see that we don't want to be ignorant. We do not want to be unwise, but we want to be understanding as to what the will of the Lord is. And finally, as we begin to wrap up this morning, verse 18. And do not be drunk with wine, in which is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always for all things to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another in the fear of God. Paul says, don't be full of distilled spirits, be full of the divine Spirit. Don't be filled with wine, which is to dissipation, debauchery, drunkenness, but be filled with the Holy Spirit. And the word there for filled in the literal Greek is a word of continuing action. It is a word that says, be ye continuously filled with the Spirit. Because this is what happens, folks. As Christians, we leak. Really. We leak. I came down here last night, and there was this big puddle on the floor in the back by where the big fish tank is that Bash just gave us when they closed their store. And I'm thinking, we sprung a leak. And I mean, you've seen how big that aquarium is, man. It was about to wash the nursery out to sea. I mean, it was really a sorry situation. And Heather, who cleans the facilities, like, what are you saying? No, it's okay. It wasn't. The fish had a fight. They splashed water all over the place. That was the mess. But it dawned on me. As Christians, we're supposed to leak. The Spirit of God is supposed to flow through our life. Isn't that what Jesus said in John chapter 7? Like torrents or rivers of gushing water, living water, the Spirit should flow through our life. Now listen, if the Spirit is flowing out of our life, guess what? You're going to need a new and a fresh filling of the Spirit so that you have this dynamic flowing of the Spirit in your life. You follow me? Good. Are you still awake? Better. Here's what happens if the Spirit isn't flowing through your life. If something in your life dams up that flow, blocks up that flow, then guess what happens? You become a stagnant, stinky pool of water. You know what I'm saying? Have you ever gone by a body of water that just doesn't flow? It just sits and sits, gets a crust over the surface of it, and pretty soon it smells. Listen, I've been to Israel twice now. And as you well know, there are two seas in Israel. One is called the Galilee. And what's fascinating about these two seas is that they are fed by the same identical river. The Jordan River flows into the Galilee. And the Galilee is teeming with fish. Yes, I looked at them. They're called St. Peter's fish. They tried to get me to eat one, but when I looked at it on the plate and that eyeball was staring at me, I'm like, lost my appetite. I'll have chicken, please. But the Galilee is teeming with life because the Jordan not only flows into it, but it flows out of it. But the next sea that the Jordan flows into is called dead, because nothing lives there. I've been there and it stinks. And the reason it's dead is because the Jordan doesn't flow out anymore. It flows in and it dies there in the body of the Dead Sea. Folks, that's what happens in your life and mine when the Spirit ceases to flow through us. When something has blocked that flowing of the Spirit, it's just a matter of time before you become spiritually dead, stinky, and like that Dead Sea. There has got to be this flowing, this continuous filling of the Spirit. As He flows out of your life, He flows into your life. As He flows into your life, He flows out of your life. That tells me that everything that God does in your life and my life, we are responsible in the sight of the Lord to go out and share with others. We're to bless others, be it with the giftedness that He's given us, the talents He's given us, the resourcefulness He's given us, whatever it is. We are to be those channels, those vessels of God's pouring forth His blessing to others, because as His blessings are poured out of our life, guess what, folks? His blessings are poured into our life. And so we see here how Paul tells us we are to be filled with the Spirit. And three evidences now as we close this morning, verses 19 through 21, that you are filled with His Spirit. Three things that will mark your life. Evidence that you are filled with God's Holy Spirit. First of all, verse 19, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. You see, the first evidence of a Spirit-filled life is a love to worship God, a love to speak of God, a love to speak of His Word, a love to sing out from your heart to Him. You see, when you love somebody, don't you want to talk about them? Really? I mean, you know that we have been blessed with our first grandchild. Want to hear about her? Really? I mean, I'll tell you, I love to talk about my granddaughter. I mean, because I love, not that I don't love her mama and papa, I love them too, you know, and her brothers and say, you know, Melinda's brothers and all of them guys, and you know, they're wonderful. But you know what? When you really love somebody, don't you want to talk about them? And that is evidence of the fullness of the Spirit in your life and mine. You want to talk about God. You want to talk about His Word. I mean, you'll sit down and you'll share with somebody what God has shown you through His Word today, what God is speaking into your life this week, what you learned at a church service or on a radio program or something. I mean, you just can't help yourself. You love them so much, you got to talk about them to somebody. And then you sing. Oh, yeah. We like to do that around here, don't we? You sing. But I so appreciate what he says here. Singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Doesn't necessarily have to be vocal. And for guys like me who don't particularly have a good voice, that's good. I can do it in my heart. Because when I sing, people will usually say, well, you sing a little lower. Okay, I'm trying to go, no, lower in volume. Please, lower in volume. Down, you know. And so I realize that even if your voice stinks, you can make melody and sing in your heart. And in fact, I hope you would agree that that's really where our worship ought to originate in the first place. It isn't what your lips are mouthing. It isn't what the vocal cords are piping. It's what the heart is pumping. It ought to be in the very center of your being. That is the origin. That is where worship ought to originate in us. Because if it is anything less than of your heart, we are no less than the religious leaders of Jesus' day when he said to them, "You draw near to me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me." I don't want to give God lip service. I want to offer him my heart. I want to give him all of me. And so we sing and we make melody and we talk of him and the beauty of his word. Secondly, verse 20, we give thanks. Giving thanks always for all things. Does the Bible really say that? Yes. Giving thanks always for all things to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. You see, as Christians, our lives are to be overflowing with thanksgiving. I've shared before about the importance of the attitude of gratitude. Because you see, it's been well said that you can't complain. Well, let me get this straight here. You cannot give thanks and complain at the same time. You cannot give thanks and complain at the same time. They are opposite. And God is saying, give thanks in all things. You know what that means? Some of those things that you don't particularly like, some of those things you don't particularly care for, some of those things that you're like, God, why me? He says, give thanks for. Because God is up to something. He may be using that in your life to develop some Christ-likeness in you, or he may be using it through your life to touch or minister or reach out to somebody else. But I am firmly convinced that there is nothing as a child of God that comes into your life or mine that isn't what I call Father filtered. It doesn't get the permissive will of God to come into our lives in the first place. Which means that everything we should give thanks. Even those things that we don't appreciate, even those things that we don't approve, even those things that we don't like, still, even as we learned in our study of Isaiah last Thursday night, he's the potter. We're the clay. Who are we to challenge what the potter is doing in our life? If he wants to put his molding finger in an area of my life and it hurts and I squirm and I squeal, God really knows what he's doing. And I don't. And as I've shared with you guys before, I again share this morning, please know that he is working for your eternal good, not your temporal benefit. God is developing you to be a citizen of eternity. Because this life, the scripture says, is but a vapor of smoke. It is going to pass away faster than you can bat an eyelash. And he's working for our eternal good, not our temporal benefit. And so the second evidence of the Spirit-filled life is that we are people filled with thankful hearts. Always giving thanks for all things to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. And then catch this third one as we close now. Verse 21. Submitting. Ooh. Just the word sends shudders up people's spines, doesn't it? Submitting to one another in the fear of God. Now, one of the reasons that this verse really sends shockwaves through our being is because of what the next verse says, as we've heard used and yes, even misused so many times. Wives, submit to your husbands. Yeah. No. You see, before Paul ever said that, he said this. Submit to one another. Before you ever get spiritual and say, honey, submit to your husband. Ooh. Verse 21 says, submit to one another. Which means that I have to submit to her before I ask her to submit to me, which means that we're to be submitting to one another just as the scripture tells us to submit to one another. What does the word submission mean? Glad you asked. In the words of Warren Wiersbe, he writes, the idea of submission doesn't have anything to do with someone being smarter or better or more talented. It has to do with a God-appointed order of things. Anyone who has ever served in the armed forces knows that rank has to do with order and authority, not with value or ability. Good point. You see, submission has absolutely nothing to do with someone being better than another. In fact, as Wiersbe comments, and he's right on, all it has to do with an order of things. And God, as we read in 1 Corinthians 14, is a God of order. He's established order. Therefore, He's established a way that relationships should function and flow. And after all, He created us. Who better knows how those things ought to work than the one who made them? And as long as we flow in that creative design, everything works harmoniously and beautifully. But it's when we don't that all kinds of bumps and bruises, heartaches and headaches result. You see, just because you find yourself submitting to someone else doesn't mean that they're better than you are, smarter than you are, or more valuable than you are. Nowhere do we have a better example of this than at work, really, right? Now, if some of you are bosses, please don't be offended here this morning. But seriously, no doubt there are people in your workforce that are probably smarter, more competent, or more capable than their boss. Wouldn't you agree? I know some of you do. You let your boss know that on a regular basis, don't you? When I was taking philosophy in college, I had to read a book called The Peter Principle. And maybe you've read it or maybe you're familiar with what it says, but basically it says that we promote people to the level of their incompetence. You may be thinking that about your very boss at this moment. Shame on you. But really, what the point is, the Peter Principle is somebody does a really good job, you know, as the low man on the totem pole. So what do? You reward him by bumping him up. And he does an okay job at the next level, so you bump him up. And pretty soon you just keep bumping him up to that position where he is totally incompetent, incapable of doing anything in that position that requires. And so, again, you find yourself submitting to people like that in the workplace, don't you? Submitting to a boss who occupies a desk, fills an office, but has absolutely no competence or capabilities to do what's before him. But yet, he's your boss. And you submit to him. And the same thing is true in Christian relationships. We are to submit to one another, the Scripture says here, out of the fear of God. Not because I'm better than you or you are better than me. And please understand that. That was a whole point through 1 Corinthians chapter 12 when we spoke about the body of Christ. The head can't do without the foot. The eye can't do without the heart. One member is just as important as the next. No one is better or lesser than the next person. But that doesn't mean that we aren't to submit to one another. This whole idea of submission, I guess, can be summed up in two words that I coined from Gail Irwin, and that is being others-centered. Putting others before yourself. Really, when you submit yourself to someone else, you're putting them before you. You know what you've just done? What Jesus has asked you to do. Die to self. Die to self. Putting others first, putting ourselves last. Maybe you've seen that acronym, JOY. I like to use it a lot when I teach out of Luke chapter 17, I think it is, where it describes how the disciples came back with great joy because they had served the Lord. And you know, serving the Lord really does produce joy in your life. That's why Armour does what he does. That's why I do what I do. That's why you do what you do, because there's no greater joy to be found in this world than comes from serving God. But you know, that word joy can be spelled out in acronym form, putting Jesus first, others next, yourself last. You want real joy in your life? Adopt that as your life principle. Jesus first, others second, yourself last. And see if the joy of the Lord won't overflow your life in a way that will marvel and blow your minds. Hey, read ahead. We will finish chapter 5 next time. Let's pray.